It started recording. Yeah. Okay, thanks for that suggestion, whoever made that. Thanks, Kuldeep. Okay, using BDD as an automation tool. What are all the things that can go wrong? Okay, a typical, agile process is the product owner or the BA gives the user story to the developer picks it, then he develops the code, gives it to the QA. The QA, worst case, does some manual testing. Best case, does some automation and maybe using BDD for automation. Then he reports the bug. What's the issue with this? The issue is, first of all, the bug can be avoided if the collaboration happens upfront. So if the QA, developer and the BA gets together and have a proper collaboration and have a common understanding, then the bugs can be reduced. Worst case, what will happen is in many projects I've seen, once the bug's been raised, the developer and QA discuss quite a lot and finally try to clarify the requirement with the product owner or the BA. And this happens towards the end of the sprint because that's where the testing would have got completed. This is by far the worst scenario and it happens time and again. Sorry, I just got a few more to join. It happens time and again in many projects. So if the main issue I've noticed is, and many industry stalwarts have noticed is, this is mainly because the three amigos are not in sync. Yes, some teams do collaboration of the user story, but still there's always that missing element. There's always that misunderstanding. Let's look at why it happens. Let's look at what is wrong with the user stories and why BDD. So what's wrong with that user story? No, this, I don't know if some of you have read Mythical Man Month. If you haven't, please do. It's a brilliant book. It was written in 1975 by Frederick. I think is the architect for some of the IBM supercomputers and things like that. He explains that one of the hardest thing in building a software is explaining what to build. I completely agree with them. The reason being, if you have to explain something, it needs to be in natural language, and natural language can be interpreted in many ways. Let's look at an example, a simple example. How do you brush? We should all know this, at least we should know this, right? So let's look at the description. Yeah, a simple description of how you can brush your teeth. Yes, the description can be improved, but however you improve, there's always, someone will misinterpret. Imagine someone who has never seen someone brushing in their life, or they have never seen a toothbrush in their life. Imagine if you have to give this description to a robot and it has to interpret and start brushing. It might end up being like this, or it can also be a different interpretation. This is what typically happens when requirements are given to the team, when they are not domain experts. So their misinterpretation is completely different. What the product owner or the BA think in their head on what they've written, it might completely make sense to them, but not to the team. So how do you fix this? You fix it through an example. If I have to teach someone on how to brush, I show them how to brush. So with BDD, what you typically do is you write the requirement as an example, as a real world example. You show them exactly what the user journey is. If you think someone named John has come to your website and does some user journey, you explain what John does. You explain through example. Even better, you collaborate. You collaborate with them. You discuss about how to brush your teeth. What is the right way to brush your teeth? What are all the things to avoid? Then everyone participate in the discussion, everyone understands. That's the best way to even explain a requirement. You explain a requirement through collaboration, get everyone to participate, and write scenarios as real world examples. This is where BDD is really, really good. So what you do, at least I did was, we moved BDD at the top of the development life cycle. So as soon as we get the user story, the first thing we do is gather together and start discussing as a team. So this is what happens. So the three amigos sit together, collaborate, formulate the scenarios. If you have other team members who are essential for that user story, let's say a UX engineer or an architect, then it's important you include them. Recently, even with all that experience, recently, we did a project, a small project. For that, we didn't include the architect, which is quite important in that particular thing. So as a result, what happened was what the scenarios that we derived, the architect was not in sync. As a result, we had to do a lot of rework. So it is important you include, definitely the three amigos have to be there. You also include other team members who are essential to develop that story. Then you derive the story as scenarios, different scenarios, both positive scenarios and negative scenarios. These scenarios basically becomes your working document. The entire team refers to this document. If anything goes wrong on the development side, anything goes wrong on the test QA side, you always go back to this document, discuss about the scenarios that's been agreed. This is what your agreement is. This is what your contract is. So once the scenarios are laid out, once the team agrees, that's what they are going to implement, both the developer and the QA start at the same time. Hello? Sorry, do you have any questions? Okay, so the developer takes each scenarios and starts implementing the solution. And the QA takes each scenarios and start writing the test scripts or the automation scripts in this case. And by doing that, what happens now is the developer completely understands what he's implementing, the different scenarios, all the positive and the negative scenarios they have to handle. The QA exactly knows what they have to test. And most importantly, both the three amigos, the developer, the QA, and the product owner or the BA are in sync. That's the beauty about BDD, if you start implementing it properly. Okay. So in many projects, we did that. Brilliant, bugs have reduced, the time to market improved, quality improved, the teams are happy, empowered. But what we realized was it didn't give exactly the same result we were expecting. We still saw some of the issues that we have seen before, where the requirement clarification was happening after the testing, while the testing was happening, or after the development is done. So then we analyzed what the issue could be. The issue was collaboration technique. What happened was we mentioned collaboration at this point. The team collaborates and formulates scenarios, which still happened. But over a period of time, what we realized was the collaboration was for the sake of collaboration. Whoever is the loudest or the strongest in the team basically started driving the meeting. The BA, for an example, who understands these requirements, started driving the meeting, started telling the team what they need to do. So that defeated the whole purpose. So all it did was the collaboration process. It became just a red tape and there was no tangible outcome. While I was looking for a solution for this, how to bring a proper collaboration and things like that, I came across a technique called Oopsie. This was coined by Jenny Martin and Pete Buckney. You can Google it and find. Jenny used to be my colleague, a brilliant QA, and now she's become an agile coach. They came up with this concept, and I started implementing this, and then started seeing huge benefit. And now I recommend Oopsie pretty much for every project I go, and we have been using it thoroughly for some time now, and we see great benefit. So what is Oopsie? I'll just give you an overview, but please feel free to go and read it. And if you want to know more about it, just drop me an email. I will go through with you. I'll go through some of the Oopsie sessions I've gone through. Obviously, I can't disclose the confidential material, but I've also done for some of my private projects, so I can go through with you. But it's by far the best I've used. So what is Oopsie? It's an acronym. So O stands for outcome. Outcome is nothing but your business value. You always focus on a business value. When a user story is given, you look at that and see what the business value is. You write the business value on the board. The team should always focus on the business value, because end of the day, that's why you're developing the product. or a software to give a business value. Then you define what the outputs are. In order to achieve that business value, that outcome, you need to define what all the output. Do I need to send an email? That's an output. The data has to be stored in a database. That's an output. The data has to be sent to a third party. That's an output. So basically you define all the output. Then you define the process. The process is nothing but your process flow diagram. What are the things you need to do in order to get that output? It could be a very high level process flow diagram, but it has to be a process flow diagram. And it has to, if you are using UI, it has to have that user journey as well. You can also use this to come up with wireframe just to show that user journey, how it all going to work. So the process basically aligns to the output. So from the process, you need to dot it to the output. So using this process, we need to send this email. Using this process, we are going to send a message to the third party. Then once the process being defined, then it's easy to define all the scenarios because you will have your process flow diagram. Then you can define scenarios. So look at the process and say, okay, now what happens if it comes to this process? What is the output? So you define a scenario for it. This will tremendously help you because let's say in the process, if you have a diamond flow, which basically tells, okay, it can go to any type of flow, basically an if statement. Then the process will also have to have two processes or three processes to depending on what the diversion is in the process flow diagram. So it actually falls well in defining these scenarios, and you will end up defining quite a lot of scenario, not only a lot of scenario, very useful scenarios. Then finally, you look at input. The input, you basically come up with these input in order to execute those scenarios correctly. What are the inputs I require in order for me to run these scenarios or implement these scenarios? So once we put together this oopsie, we started seeing a lot of benefit because now in some projects, I've come up with a process where we basically empower the team, not just one person, but we split the responsibility. So we said, okay, the outcome, the business value has to be explained by the BA or the product owner because they know the best. So the outcome, business owner or the product owner or the BA explains the business value to the team. Then we said the output and the process has to be explained by the developer. So in the collaboration process, the developer comes onto the board and explains what are the output in order to achieve that business value and what is my process flow, because the developer understands the process flow or the code flow more than anyone else. So developer actually details the process flow. Then the QA jumps in and says, okay, for this process, these are all the scenarios you can come up with because they wear the QA hat. They come up with all sorts of scenarios, both positive and negative. And the QA also discuss about what all the input required for the QA and for also the developer in order to achieve these scenarios. So as you can see, the three amigos are involved now, not just one person driving the meeting, but all three are together driving the meeting, deriving these scenarios. Now, by doing that, the team is empowered, the team is involved. So when you involve the entire team, part of deriving these scenarios, they tend to understand it better. So once that's done, the oopsie basically gives you all the scenarios that are required for that user story. That basically becomes your requirement document. What happens in a traditional way, if you do that, typically what will happen is they'll think about input first, then scenario, then process. Finally, the team will think about the business value. When you do that, it's nothing but a spoof. It's just upside down. So they just transferred it. They made it upside down. So, the business values is always at the top of the pyramid. I can't emphasize enough, give it a try or send a mail to me or message me. It's brilliant. I've been using Oopsie for some time now, and the benefits are immense. Okay, the third one, which is the most difficult one, and I've seen quite a lot of issues in many projects, and I continue to see this issue, is underestimating automation. It is not easy. I know that, but still, it is so difficult to get it right. You need to have that right experience rolling out BDDs in many projects. So I'll go through some of the issues I've come across. First, let's look at the overview about what are the issues at a high level. Automation is expensive. It is important you acknowledge this. The reason being, let's say you have a Scrum team consists of, let's say, 5 people, 3 devs, 1 BA, and 1 automation engineer. It's never going to work because imagine the developers, 3 developers are likely to work in 3 different stories. You have only 1 automation engineer who has to work with all the 3 developers, write test scripts for all the stories they are developing. On top of that, do their testing and also participate in all sorts of collaboration. You're never going to, he or she is never going to complete their task in terms of automating all the user stories within that sprint. So as a result, I've seen many projects, including the projects which I've been working, the cost is very high because they have to spend like 40 to 50% on automation engineers in a project. So let's say if you have 3 devs, you will need at least 2 automation engineers in order to achieve automation within that sprint. It is time consuming. There's no doubt about it. You need to be aware of it. If you want to achieve in sprint, which I would strongly recommend, you need to understand it is time consuming. So you need to have adequate resources. High cost of maintenance. To start with, it might look easier, but as it goes, particularly with BDD with so many steps, the code base grows rapidly. So there is a high cost of maintenance. Because the automation engineers focus mainly around coding, I've seen that they may end up spending less time on testing. The reason being, the automation engineers not necessarily are the expert in coding. They're not hired for that purpose. So as a result, what happens is when they get stuck, it could be just anything. It could be they haven't initialized a variable, or it could be an environment issue. They'll end up spending more time on coding and less time on testing. They'll start compromising on testing. But the whole purpose of automation engineer, or the whole purpose of this, is to do proper testing, which defeats the purpose. Then it is difficult to justify on an ongoing basis because the cost is so high. Also, it's time consuming. So as a result, what the teams have started doing is they do some partial automation. So they take some of the scenarios and automate only certain scenarios. It is an issue because when issue regress, you're never sure whether your code base is working correctly, and it defeats the whole purpose of automating your project. Like you're never a DevOps. There's always some element of manual testing involved, which I wouldn't recommend at all. And some teams have adopted N-1 automation, which means the sprint happens. Let's say you have a 2-week sprint. The automation completes in the next 2 weeks. So in total, like it takes 4 weeks. The issue with that is your definition of done now is extended for that 4 weeks. And also what happens if the QA or the engineer finds an issue towards the end of the 4th week, and if it's a major issue, then you have lost all that time. So I wouldn't recommend this as well. And I've seen a lot of issues with both the approach. That's the overview about automation issues, all the things you need to consider. So what are all the issues in implementing the automation? Like when you actually implement the automation in terms of coding, the first mistake is, taking the serial run. So when you automate your BDDs, you have an option to either do a parallel run or a serial run. And parallel run does require some time to set up, but I've seen in many projects, I've never seen a project where they started thinking about parallel run from day one. It's always a serial run. Let's get it working. That's how they start. It is not an issue when you start. When you start with a serial, let's say if you're running 5 scenarios serially, and each scenario takes, like, say, 10 seconds, it finishes like, in 50 seconds. It's not an issue. What happens is 1 month, 2 months down the line, as the scenarios grow, you will see the time take to run your automation suite takes about maybe 15-20 minutes. It's still not an issue, but this team starts thinking about it. 4 months, 5 months down the line, it starts taking 30 minutes. That's when this team really starts thinking about it. But the problem is you will never find time to go and fix issues so that your test suite becomes, you run them parallelly, because it does require a lot of thinking, because you need to start thinking about using unique IDs. You need to also write code in such a way that you can run the code in parallel. You also need to think about, if you are using enterprise integration project, you also need to think about how to consume different messages using unique IDs. So it's not easy. You need to have, proper discussion, proper design for that. So what happens is after several months, when it starts taking 30 minutes, then now the team realizes they have to run parallel. They will never get that opportunity to go back and work on rewriting some of their automation scripts in order to make it parallel. It is quite a long-winded process. So as a result, the team will put up with that. Then over in a year, in 2 years, it'll start running for hour and a half and 2 hours or 2 hours. Then they will come up with all sort of creative thinking, like, run only, split the features as core features and non-core features. Run only the core features, run only the non-core features, but it's never a perfect solution. So by far, if you are going to use one of the, script-based automation, like Cucumber or something else, always think about running it parallel from day one. By far, I would say this is the most important one when you actually implement automation. The second one is hard-coded test messages. Hard-coded test messages are pain, not as bad as running it in serial, but it's still a pain because, as you all know, when the project goes, the messages, let's say if you are using JSON, or let's say if you are using XML, the messages keep changing. The business keep changing their thinking, the messages keep changing. If you are using hard-coded messages, let's imagine you have 100 scenarios. And in that, let's say one of the core schema is used pretty much in all those scenarios. I'm talking about the core schema, and the business has decided to change the core schema. Now the team has to go and update all those messages in all of those 100 scenarios, which is absolutely painful. So think about templating your test messages. Use some sort of template mechanism so you don't have to hard-code test messages. When it comes to automation, again, when writing code, lack of best practices. I've seen a lot of people saying, okay, automation is not the code that I'm going to automate, or the automation scripts is never going to be part of production. Yes, very true. It's never going to be part of production code. It's never going to be deployed in a production environment. Very, very true. But the code is going to live as long as your project lives. So you need to treat your automation code as a production code. So you need to have the right standard. You need to have the code analysis, static analysis, all of that, followed for, and achieve the best practices. What are all the design practices you use for your production code? You need to apply the same for your automation code. And this is also quite critical. The scenario that gets written, it's quite important you follow business language. And I've seen in many projects, the scenarios written are very technical. You need to treat scenarios as your requirement. Think about the scenarios that you write, that it's a proper requirement document. You should be able to take your scenarios, give it to someone who's non-technical, and they should be able to understand your business. So always use business language in your scenarios. Steps not reused, again, a classic issue. When you use a product like Cucumber, each step maps to a method. So it's very important you think about how you can reuse the step. Even if you have to rewrite some of the step and say by rewriting, if you can reuse the step, I would adopt that. Or else your code base grows rapidly. And finally, lack of reviews. Again, when the automation code is done, it's not treated like a production code. So as a result, there is no proper review. People write however they feel like, generally not of a high standard. As a result, the maintenance suffers quite a lot. So these are the mistakes, automation mistakes, you can avoid. And it's quite important, the automation, if you are planning to do implement one of the automation code, it's quite important you consider all of this. The next one is resourcing. I've put a separate slide for it. It is very tricky when it comes to resourcing for automation, for an automation engineer role. I'll explain you why. First of all, in general, I've seen there is lack of skill in the market. There are not many good automation engineers in the market. So as a result, you will struggle to find good automation engineers. So what happens is now many projects, including the projects I've worked, they take a tester, maybe send them on a course, on a coding course, and then try to make them as an automation engineer. The problem is a strong tester doesn't have to be a strong coder, and vice versa. So then what happens? You also will find out when you take a tester and try to get them to write the code may not have the same standard as a developer would code, because what I've seen is both dev and QA are different mindset, and that's why I think it works really well when you keep them separate, because dev have the mindset of providing solution, and the QAs have the mindset of finding problems and being inquisitive, asking all the questions. When you try to combine them, it doesn't always work well. Fourth point is very interesting. I've seen in many projects again, and many situations this has happened. What happens is this generally doesn't fit or apply for a senior QA. This usually applies for a junior QA, particularly for someone who's still, finding their career path. They're still deciding about their career path. So for an example, let's say you take a junior QA, send them on a course, get them to code, and then they start coding. They become an automation engineer. They become a good automation engineer. Once they become good automation engineer, I've seen in many cases, they want to become a dev because now they know how to code. They don't want to do a QA role anymore. As a result, what happens is you're not only losing a QA, you also need to find a dev role for that person, or else they'll just go to a different project or they just leave the organization. So I've seen that in many circumstances. So that's something you need to be aware of. Good automation engineers are expensive. There's no doubt about it. So as a result, your project cost goes up. It is difficult to justify, as I mentioned before, because it's expensive. Even if you get a good automation engineer, you still need to get few more, because you do require few more in order to get in sprint automation. So the automation has always been painful. I couldn't find a proper solution for this for a while. It's been on this for years. Any project I go, it's always been an issue. So as a result, based on all my understanding, all my experience, I created NoCodeBDD. What NoCodeBDD does is it takes your BDD. You don't have to write any code. It creates the automation code for you. So you using NoCodeBDD, you can automate in minutes and without any code. You don't have to write any code. It doesn't require any coding skill, as I mentioned. And it is easy to maintain because you don't have any code to maintain. All you have to maintain is your features and scenarios, which is nothing but your requirements. So there's nil or very little maintenance. It is very cheap because you don't need a specific automation engineer. You just have to use NoCodeBDD. The basic version is free. If you are planning to use a collaboration version, then there's a cost to pay, but it's cheap as chips. It allows you to focus on testing. It allows anyone to focus on testing because you spend so little time, in fact, no time on coding. You define your scenarios, provide few information to the product, and it will take care of automation. Finally, you can achieve in sprint because it's so easy to automate using NoCodeBDD. You can achieve in sprint. So I'll quickly show you a demo. It'll take a minute because the NoCodeBDD itself is quite simple. So as you can see, this is the feature. Let's look at a simple feature. Then simple scenario. I'm just going to give you an overview. Let's say when I call API, then the response should be 200. This is, let's assume that this is a very simple scenario. I just want to show you the automation side of things. What you can do is you come and define your automation scripts through step definition. You can pick any of the module you want. If you're API based, then REST. If it's MQ. If it's database SQL, then if it's UI, you don't need to go and write all the Selenium scripts. You can do that. Or let's say if you have edge cases where our product doesn't support. Let's say you have a very obscure edge case. For an example, let's say you want to call a mainframe and get some data and then compare the data. You can write a custom code as well. So in this case, I'm just going to show you the REST API. I'm just going to send API request. As you can see, the interface is very similar to Postman. So I'm just going to use a simple API. Save, and I go to the next step. Step definition, still I'm going to use REST API, and then I'm going to assert it. All I'm going to assert is what are the response I get from the REST API. 200. Just save it. I've defined my step definition now. All I have to do is just go there, run this one I've done. That's all. Your automation is done. You've defined a scenario and your automation is done. And you can also see all the information that's been passed. It gives you a complete audit log of what you have sent, what you have received, the response message that's been received, all that information. You can pretty much automate anything. The things that you can't automate, you can still write a code. So let's say if you can automate 90%, 95% of your project, and then 5% if you have edge cases, you can still automate it. So that's the beauty about NoCodeBDD. So NoCodeBDD was developed based on all my experience over the years. We have been developing this for ages, and now it's in the market. You can download it. I will send you the download link and start using it. The basic version is free, so you can give it a try. If any issues, just message me or email me. Let's go back to the presentation. Okay, I've given the demo. I've put the slide at the very end after the demo. The reason being, whether you are going to use NoCodeBDD or any other open source or like product like Cucumber, it's quite important that you don't go UI heavy. If you're an UI based project, try avoid being UI heavy. The reason being, if you are going UI heavy, first of all, you are not testing the behavior, because UI is not the behavior, not all the time. The behavior is the behavior of your application. The behavior is what is defined in the API, or the one that is actually defines the behavior of your application. When you go UI heavy, what happens is it becomes very brittle. when I say brittle, what I mean is, even if your behavior doesn't change, let's say account opening is a behavior and the API hasn't changed at all, but the UI is changed, means that all your automation scripts have to be changed. That's why it becomes very brittle. It is very slow because there is a page weight for each of those, and also it has to go through different application layers. So UI is very slow. And finally, it is difficult to maintain because if your UI keeps changing, you have to keep changing your automation script, even though it has nothing to do with the behavior of your application. So should I not include UI at all? I wouldn't say that, because I've worked on many projects again, which are UI based. Recently, did some consultancy for one of the company where they are quite UI heavy, because the application is all about data and they have to do a lot of data crunching. So they are quite UI heavy, and the data crunching has to happen on the UI side. So as a result, what we recommended was combine UI and API. Wherever you can test the behavior, use API if possible. You need to think about UI only as a last case scenario. If you think, okay, I can't test the behavior of this application through an API, and the behavior is only on the UI side. A simple example is, let's say, sorting. If the sorting happens only on the UI and it's extremely critical for the business wants to have that behavior, then you can think about using UI for that behavior only, and then use API for rest of the behavior, for rest of the scenarios. Another point, very important point, is use element ID. If you decide to go with UI, always use element ID. Don't think about using XPath because it'll keep changing. And finally, as I mentioned before, always consider parallel run at the start. All right, that's all. Q&A. You can download our product using the link I've given there. You can also follow us on the blog, and we are also quite engaged in LinkedIn. So that's all from me. So open for any questions. We've got about 15 minutes.
Hi, Jerome. Yeah, thanks for the talk. It was really interesting.
Thank you.
I just wanted to ask you a question. So, if you're working in an agile project, sorry, would you be able to turn the volume a little bit because I can hear myself? Yeah, thanks. If you're working like in an agile project, would it not be better to just get rid of the QA engineers and have developers that know how to write code and also take on the responsibility for all the testing? You're muted, by the way, Jerome. Yeah. Yeah, cool. Yeah.
Sorry, that's a great question. Sorry, your name? So I couldn't see it here. Sorry, can I know your name? Cameron.
Yeah, Cameron, yeah.
Yeah. It's a great question. Yes, we have tried that. Yeah. We have tried in several projects, but the problem with that is it doesn't always work, because generally the developers come up with a mindset that they want to develop. So when you tend to get them to do testing, it's always frowned, one. Two, what I've also seen is in projects where when you have a very strong developers, and let's say you have a couple of weak developers, generally the testing is pushed to the weak developers.
Yeah, okay.
As a result, what happens is you don't get that right combination, and it is very difficult to continue with that momentum, getting all the developers to work. It might work in a startup where pretty much everyone is engaged, the team is very small, and to carry on. But in a large project, it is very difficult to pull that off. Okay,
yeah. You make a good point. I've never really come across that situation before.
Yeah.
But I suppose my experience isn't, as vast as yours. So I just think that there is a psychological effect there when you have developers and QAs working in the same agile team. And what happens is, because there are QA engineers whose sole responsibility it is to write the tests, then I feel like often the developers feel a lack of responsibility for the testing, because there's someone else who's been employed, you know, specifically to do that job. So I was just thinking, if you remove the QA engineers from the equation, then this kind of psychological effect kicks in, where the developers suddenly feel responsible for like the quality of the code that they produce, and they're not just kind of throwing it over the wall like they traditionally do.
Okay.
What do you think?
There are two aspects to it. One is, I would strongly not recommend the developer who's developing the code to do the QA work as well, because you will get into some sort of tunnel vision where you may not see things outside of what you're coding. Second, take the second point. Let's say you are the developer coding and you bring in another developer to do the test.
Sure.
In that case, whatever you said still applies, because the developer who's doing the coding would offload all the responsibility to the other developer, thinking that's his responsibility to do the testing. That's where BDD will make a difference, because at this, you don't think BDD as testing at all.
Yeah.
What you do is you define your requirements basically as scenarios at the start of the development process, where everyone gets involved and everyone agrees to it, including the BA or the product owner, along with your developer and, you know, let's say tester, if you have a tester. By agreeing to it, you know, the developer exactly knows what are all the scenarios they have to write, and the QA exactly knows what are all the testing they have to do. So there is no conflict of interest, in the sense that the developer doesn't have to think, okay, it's QA's responsibility to go and do a testing. There's no concept of testing. You agree the scenarios. The QA is going to make sure whatever the developer has implemented is what the is as per the scenarios. That's what the QA is going to check.
Yeah. Okay. I think you make a good point about that psychological like feeling of not being responsible for the quality of the code would still be there somewhat if you had, you know, developers just solely writing the tests. But then I think the situation is slightly better, because if you didn't have the same developers always developing the test code in this scenario, then, you know, they'd swap over and they'd all be working on the same test project, you know, so they'd have like a sense of shared responsibility and ownership over this.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But what I've seen is, even if you get rid of your QA, if you manage to, which I find it very difficult in a large project, if you manage to, you still have to go through, if you still have to come out of the mindset of having, development and testing separately. It's with the modern development life cycle, you don't separate them. You agree upfront, okay, these are the scenarios I'm going to implement. You go ahead and write automation script for those scenarios. I will go ahead and implement a proper solution for that. And then once we are ready, we will both combine together. There is no concept of, no, I've done my development, here you go and do your testing.
Yeah.
As a shared responsibility, you come up with the scenarios.
It should be done in parallel. Yeah, I agree. But it almost seems like if you had one developer writing the application code, another developer doing the BDD tests in parallel, it would almost be like some sort of TDD pair programming scenario, right? Which, seems to work quite well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But TDDs.
What do you reckon?
No, absolutely. That's how it should be. But that doesn't mean that we can eliminate TDD, because TDD is completely different. It's for the developer in order to write better code. And the testers don't get involved, or the other developer who's writing the BDD won't get involved. The TDD is for the developer. No, I do get your point. But in my experience, what I've seen is it is very difficult to pull it off. We did try. It's not that we haven't tried.
Okay.
It is, the developers have the mindset, and it is difficult to pull it off on a long run. And also the team dynamics changes, because as I've said, the strong coders continue to provide a solution, and the weak coders slowly end up being the testers.
Yeah, so like in the long term, you just end up in the same situation as you would be if you had QA engineers.
Exactly.
Because they almost are like QA engineers by proxy, aren't they?
Yeah.
And yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. What kind of projects have you worked on?
So the current project, obviously, I can't reveal the project details. It's the current project which I'm consulting is a large government project, massive government project. We have, we have been using. We are quite BDD heavy. Without BDD, I don't know how we could even run this project. It's quite complicated. There are more than 30 plus applications, more than 300. Just within our project, we have more than 300 features, more than 2,000 scenarios. And previous to that, and also in parallel, I've been consulting for small companies, medium-sized organizations. Previous to that, I worked on a large banking project where we completely screwed up on the BDD. I put my hand up. So learned a lot. And also, like, on a small projects also I've worked where, implementing BDD properly really made wonders. So I wouldn't embark on any project without BDD these days.
Okay. So do you use your NoCodeBDD solution in your current project then?
No.
Why is
because the reason being, the NoCodeBDD is fairly new. I've got like 2-3 clients, small clients. Okay. The current project is quite because it's a government project. They have the process to get into any government sector, so it's not easy for any startups like ours to break into that sector. So there is a remote chance. I didn't even approach the current project. I know that the chances are very remote, but hopefully at some day, I hope they start using it.
Okay, yeah, that's cool. Yeah, I'm one of those people that you mentioned in your slideshow. I'm a QA engineer.
Are you?
And, I want to be a dev because I've learned how to code now, and that's like the next thing. So that is really true what you said about that.
Yeah, I've seen that time and again.
QA engineers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've seen that time and again. A QA engineer comes, they start doing some coding, and then they become a developer over a period of time. That's something that we all should be mindful of. That's nothing wrong. You are selecting a career path, but it's just that it is what it is. As long as you plan for it, then it's not an issue.
Cool.
Excellent. No worries. Any other questions? Okay, if there are no questions, I just want to ask a few questions now. Is there anything else you want me to cover in my next meetup? If you are interested for me to cover any topic around BDD, I'm more than happy to come up with a topic and go through that with you.
Can you actually go through some scenarios in BDD? Because in one of my previous companies, we were misusing BDD as actually, like, there would be like, and I open the model and I enter this text and I click OK and the model disappears, that kind of stuff. That's a misuse of BDD. So if you could throw some light on what's good and what's bad kind of scenarios to write or steps to write.
Okay.
How detailed to go in or how not to go into details. That's what I would like to see.
Okay, that's a very classic issue, Sandeep. That won't be the first time, and that won't be the last time. In many projects they do. So yeah, it's a great point. What I will do is I'll try and schedule a meetup where I will explain how to write BDDs. Maybe we can go through an oopsie session as a collaboration session, and we'll come up with scenarios. And in that session, we'll also discuss about how to write proper BDDs.
Yeah, that sounds like a good idea. Thanks.
No worries.
Yeah, sorry, can I ask, would this recording be available for us?
Yeah, I can upload it, Patrick. Yes, certainly. And I will also send you the PowerPoint.
Okay, thank you.
No worries. Okay, any other question?
Hi, Jerome.
Hi, Kuldeep.
Not any questions in particular, but yeah, just to kind of sink in with what you said, and I know we have discussed this a couple of times earlier as well. I think you just being a QA and being a good tester and maybe not being able to code that well, you just kind of get lost in the automation and you just feel like, how would you progress with the things? But then also keeping in mind, if you get heavy on coding, then that may impact your actual testing.
Yeah.
And you may get deviated from it. So thinking about that, no code BDD sounds really appealing, and it does appear to be kind of that something that has kind of unblocked the whole passage. You can just maybe actually focus on the testing and don't get so heavy on your coding. But I'm really excited to see this, and I would definitely want to give it a shot, maybe for my personal use, but would definitely give that a shot.
Oh, thanks, Kuldeep. Yeah, for all of you who don't know Kuldeep, is my colleague. She's worked as a brilliant QA. She's the head of QA in at IBM. And I know Kuldeep for a while. She knows that I'm developing a product, but I don't think she has never ever seen it. Yeah, Kuldeep, thank you. I'm glad that you found it very helpful. If you haven't, I'm sure you would have told me that. Yeah, thank you for that. Any other question? Any other request before we close the call?
Yeah, how to get it?
Sorry? Okay, I hope you found this presentation useful. If you have any questions, anything about BDD, just ping me, message me. I'm always here, and hopefully I'll come up with a meetup soon. I hope to see all of you in that meetup. And in the next meetup, I'll be very mindful about the time zone. I'm sorry about it again. I didn't realize about the time zone issue. I'll be very mindful.
Yeah, actually, I also on this note, I wanted to tell you that I know someone who wanted to join, but they couldn't because on Meetup it was showing that the event has passed.
Oh,
It was only 7:05 at that point, so I think that was again due to the timing thing. But yep.
okay. I need to see what settings I have to change in the meter. All right. Thanks a lot, everyone. Many thanks, and thanks for participating.
All right. Cheers, Jerome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jerome.
Bye.
Nice session.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
things started, the background, and then how, right, what would be the main barriers and